Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 311. Title chaptered, The Philman Tragedy. Everyone seemed to have trouble getting along with George Philman. He was an old man, and some felt that he was insane. He lived with his wife, Anna, and grown daughter, Maddie, on a couple of 100 acres on the east side of 9 Mile Point, about a mile below the Whittinger place. His oldest son, Roscoe, had taken up a place directly across the point from him on the west side. Another son, Wes, had filed on 160 acres right on the end of 9 Mile Point. They had all come out to the Madeline Plains from Des Moines, Iowa, in the spring of 1911, when the Madeline Meadows advertisement campaign was at its peak back there. In fact, that is what started the first disagreement, the Madeline Meadows main canal that ran around the west side of the plains. It ended a half a mile away from George Philman's property, on a piece of land owned by Grover Smith. Now, Philman owned a water right, however, and if the water had ever gotten that far, there was a lateral ditch running south to his land from the end of the canal. Of course, the water from Tule Lake never got that far. It was the spring runoff water that brought on the first squabble. In the spring of 1914, there was an immense runoff, and because of it, there was a raging torrent of water coming down the canal. At the end of the main canal, there was a waste gate and a waste ditch running out across the upper side of Grover's land. But the floodwaters were too swift and too much for it to handle, and the smaller ditch running down the Philmans was flowing full. George threw up a dam on this ditch where it crossed his property line. Then he went over into Grover's property and cut a ditch back, forcing the water out into the Smith land. Thus, Grover's land was being flooded by both the waste ditch and the lateral ditch running down to Philman's property. He had a crop of rye that was flooded out. Grover could not get Philman to remove the dam or cooperate with him in any way, so he took the matter to court. The court found that Philman had no right to touch the ditch or the waste gate or any other property belonging to the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company. At the same time, George filed a countersuit against Grover, charging him with stealing water during the irrigation season the first year before. The court could find no evidence that there was any evidence of the water in the canal, let alone that Grover had stolen it. Over the next couple of years, the two parties continued at odds over one thing or another. Grover and his brother Tom had torn down all the buildings in the old Smith station and moved the lumber out to the homestead for Grover to build his house and outbuildings and corrals. The boys had dug a well over 100 feet deep to get water. It had a platform built over it with a hand pump in the center. One morning, when Grover's mother was staying there for a few days, she went down to the well for water. She happened to notice a few flecks of sawdust on the platform, and on closer inspection, it could be seen that someone had all but sawed the boards in front of the pump in two. Had she stepped up on the platform, there would have collapsed, sending her tumbling to the bottom of the well. Grover was gone for several days at the time, so she was there all alone, except for one of her small grandchildren whom she was keeping. Lige Cadell had been riding up from his place every day to check on her, so when he showed up, he fixed the platform. The Smiths could think of no one who hated them so much as to mastermind a deed like that, except George Philman. So naturally, he got the blame. Grover lived on his place all the time that he was not off somewhere working for someone else. His brother Tom generally came out and stayed with him wherever he had time from his engineer's job at the NCO. One evening in the late November of 1916, they went down into Grover's plowed field below the house. Tom Smith was carrying a rifle. When they got down near the division fence between the Smith and Philman properties, they came upon George Philman. He was, according to their later testimony, piling brush against the side of the fence. But on Grover's side, there were a bunch of rocks, recently thrown over the fence into the plowed field. It was not the first time the rocks had shown up on the plowed ground where there had previously been none. As the two Smith boys came upon Philman, Grover said, "We have caught you at some of your tricks now." Then is when the first mistake was made. He crawled through the fence on Philman's side. When he straightened up after getting through the fence, he was confronted by George Philman, jabbing at him with his pitchfork. With his back against the fence, the only defense Grover could make of his person was to bend down and throw his arms up in front of his face. In the next instant, Tom, who was on the other side of the fence, had the rifle up, firing off a shot at the advancing Philman. The very next instant, Philman was on the ground, and the two Smiths were straddling in horror at what had just transpired. It had all happened so fast that everyone was amazed, especially Tom Smith. Once they realized the seriousness of the situation, Tom set the gun down and crawled through the fence. He and Grover helped the wounded man to his feet. Then, with one of them supporting him on each side, they helped him to his house where he was laid on a bed. The two boys went home in a state of shock. Mrs. Philman called Madeline on the telephone, and Mrs. Fritz, in turn, called to Susanville to report the incident. Sheriff Hunzinger, District Attorney Pardee, and Dr. Walsh were dispatched to the scene. They arrived the next morning on the NCO. By the time they got out to Philman's place, it was late morning. George was still alive, but in a rather serious condition. After the doctor had examined him, it was decided to move him to Susanville for treatment. Hunzinger, Walsh, and the two Philman women got him loaded into the buggy that had brought the men out to the place and started back to Madeline to catch the down train. Mrs. Pardee sat down to wait for the local law, Snide Evans, to arrive. Snide had been notified over the telephone at the Brockmans. When he arrived, the two men went up to Grover's house. They talked this matter over with the two Smith boys. Pardee decided that they had better be brought in for a preliminary hearing. So Snide made the arrest, and Grover and Tom were taken to jail in Susanville. George Philman lived for a week before dying from the gunshot wound November 22nd, 1916. The bullet had entered his side, puncturing his liver and right lung. Before he died, he swore out a dying statement, some of which was denied by his wife and daughter at the trial of Tom Smith. Now, the dying statement reads as follows, quote, "I, George Philman, being seriously wounded and believing that I am going to die, do make the following statement relative to the manner in which I received my wound. They were harrowing at their own land and heaved rocks over onto my land, and I laid them over against our line fence. I mean by then Grover and Tom Smith, they came right on to me while I was piling the rocks next to the fence. One of them said, 'You bastard, son of a bleep. We will get you,' I said. 'I am not throwing rocks on your land. I am just putting the rocks on the brush to keep the wind from blowing them around,' and then Tom shot me. I mean by Tom, Grover Smith's brother. Grover started over the fence, and I tried to keep him back with the dug fork. I tried to hold the fork in front of the Grover to keep him from coming on my land, but he came over. They both had guns. I did not have a gun, nothing but a fork. I was piling the brush along the fence and putting rocks on it. I did not strike either of them with a fork, just held it up to keep him from coming over the fence. Grover was the one who was trying to cross the fence. He did not get over until Tom shot me. I think that Grover Smith told his brother Tom not to shoot, but of this I'm not certain. It was all done so quickly. At all time I was on my side in the fence. Grover came over the fence I tried to keep him back with a fork. When Grover was trying to get across the fence, Tom shot me. After I was shot, Grover was going to give me a beating, and I told him not to, that I was dying. He picked me up and shook me around. I told him not to shake me. I was dying. They, Grover and Tom, then went off and left me lying on the ground. Afterwards, I got up by the aid of the fence post and walked toward my house, and my son and daughter met me and helped me to the house. G.M. Philman. And the witness signed F.D. Walsh, M.D., S.L. Damon. Unquote. Well, a preliminary hearing was held in Susanville, and Tom Smith was held over on a charge of murder, and Grover was released. Trial was set on February 17, 1917 at 10 o'clock a.m. Tom was released on bail. And before the trial, Snide Evans' deputy, Clint Olch, served subpoenas on almost all the Smiths' neighbors to testify in Tom's behalf. From January 27th until February 5th, he served subpoenas to many people, which are listed here on page 315. Now, Dr. F.D. Welsh and W.E. Dozer were also summoned to testify at the trial, as was S.L. Damon. 5 material witnesses in the Des Moines, Iowa, were also questioned under oath and their statements read in court. Anna, Maddie, and Wes Philman also testified. Everyone on the Madeliners, including his own family, testified that George had been extremely difficult to get along with. The 2 doctors who had treated him both testified that he may have lived if he would have cooperated with them in their treatment of his wound. The witnesses in Des Moines were asked 9 questions about their acquaintance, Mr. Philman, where they had known him, how long they had known him, etc. The 8th question asked, quote, "Are you acquainted with the general reputation of G.W. Philman in the community in which he resided during your acquaintance with him for peace and quiet?" All 5 witnesses answered yes. Then question number 9 was, quote, "Is it good or bad?" unquote, to which all 5 answered, quote, "Bad," unquote. When the trial was over, Tom was acquitted, but there was no rejoicing. A man was dead, regardless of his reputation. That was something that was to bother Tom for the rest of his life. A sudden act to prevent his brother from being stabbed with a pitchfork, a reaction, occurring without time to think, left him sored on the Madeline Plains. Never again did he want to talk or hear about the country where he was raised. He left the plains, never to return again. All right, we're going to go into the next chapter, titled 1916, The Hardest Winter on Record. If the workers on the NCO thought they had problems previously, the winter of 1916 brought on a real lesson of difficulty. The winter of 1911 had produced a blockade across the Madeline Plains for 2 weeks due to heavy snowdrift. But a record was set in 1916. Sage Hen Flat was covered so deeply with snow that the tracks were blocked for 22 days. Out of 14 engines owned by the Little Railroad, only 2 were operational, the rest being snowbound or off the tracks. The winter was so difficult in more ways than one. Besides the heavy snows, winds were fierce, causing extreme drifting, and thermometers generally hovered around 20 degrees at night. Molly Brockman died that winter of acute myocarditis. Dr. Smith had been caring for her for over a month. She was only 40 at the time of her death. The funeral was held at the Brockman Ranch, and the saddened community came in sleighs through the bitter cold from miles around. She was buried there, awaiting better weather to transfer the body to the family plot in Susanville. Willis was left with 3 small sons and no wife to help in their raising. Later, he would marry Winnie Cox. As the winter drug on around, another problem began to develop. The wild animal population was infested with rabies, and an epidemic quickly broke out. Willis Brockman, who was of Lassen County supervisor at the time, obtained a shipment of strychnine capsules. He and the two local deputy sheriffs, Snide Evans and Clint Olch, who were both Brockman buckaroos, distributed poisoned meat all over the plains in an attempt to cut down on the numbers of rabid coyotes and bobcats. Now, George Weaver was working for Paul Talbot feeding livestock that winter. One crisp morning, while he was pitching hay from a low haystack into feed bunks, he turned around to find a rabid, frothing coyote not 4 feet from him. Instinctively, he jammed his 3-pronged pitchfork into the animal's, driving the middle tine deep into its chest. Moving quickly, he pushed the furious coyote, pitchfork and all, off the stack on one side, and he jumped off the other. George ran and got Mr. Talbot, who came on the run with a shotgun and finished killing the animal. They cut its head off, wrapped it in a gunny sack, and sent it to Susanville on the NCO. Since there was so much snow and the ground was frozen so hard, they could not bury the carcass. So they drug it into the hills east of the Talbot place. A few days later, word came back from Susanville that the coyote had indeed been rabid. The disease, of course, did not stay exclusively in the wild animal population. Over on the Williams Ranch, George and Myrtle Williams' little daughter, Dorothy, was playing with her dog one day when the animal bit her. Since time was of the essence, the Williams family did not wait around for lab results to come back in the analysis of the little dog that eventually was shown to have the disease. Over at Likely, Dolphin Eva Van Lowen's young son, Kenneth, had also been bitten by a dog. The Van Loans brought him up to Madeline, and grandmother Mona Williams sent out on the NCO, which was mobile by then, with the 2 small children. They traveled to Oakland and spent the next few days at the home of Elmer and Ollie Van Loan. There the children received the Pasteur treatment for rabies. At 5 years of age, it was a trial for both of them, but they survived, bringing a great relief to the families of the community. All in all, the winter of 1916 was a rough one. Everyone on the Madeline Plains was happy to see the emergence of spring once again. All right, next chapter, page 318, it's about schools. It's titled Schools. Schools, like ranches, were established early in the Madeline Plains and continued onward. Not without change, however, the homestead era, because the enormous influx of people to the area necessitated more schools. Where the Madelene School had once taken care of the entire western side of the Madeline Plains, it now became necessary to have more grade schools. 3 to be exact. High school, however, still had to be taken elsewhere if the scholar decided to go that far. Dry Valley School. Actually, the Dry Valley School was established before the turn of the century, but its ranks swelled at the Homestead era. Originally, it sat just barely through Dry Valley Gap on the Dry Valley side. Later, when there was more students on the Plains side, it was put on skids and drug into the Madeline Plains about halfway between the Gap and Isaac McCaff's place. Before a school had been established, Ike Metcalf had boarded a teacher at his house and enough children to operate a school. With the establishment of the Dry Valley School, students came from the Bailey Creek area, Dry Valley, Grasshopper Valley, and Eagle Lake, with the exception of Rachel McCrary, who came over the hill from Grasshopper. And a few others, Ike and Mary Metcalf, boarded most of the teachers, even after school had been established and built. There was a small living quarters at one end of the schoolhouse that some of the teachers chose to live in. Myrtle Hicks, a widow, was one of those who lived there with her 3 children, Ida, Ted, and Bob. A few of the other teachers were Mary Thompson, Blanche Snyder, and Mrs. Peters and Emma Opie. A typical schedule for the day of Dry Valley School went as follows. 9 o'clock to 10:40 was a salute the flag, sing, 10 minutes of exercise, and then arithmetic. Now from 10:40 to 11 you had recess. From 11 to 12 you had reading, spelling, and then lunch. Lunch at 12 to 1. And then after lunch from 1 to 2:40 you had reading by the teacher, 10 minutes of exercise, reading from the lower grades, physiology and civics for the upper grades, geography were grades 3 to 4. Then from 2:40 to 3 you had recess. From 2:40 to 3 you had recess. From 3 to 4 you had agriculture, drawing and penmanship on Fridays, bookkeeping, 8th grade class. Then you had geography and history, 8th grade to 2nd semester. All right, let's go on to McDonald Peak School. The next school district to be established was the McDonald Peak School District. It lasted the least amount of time and was often referred to as Valley Center School. It was established on January 6, 1910, and a school building was soon erected due to the west side of the Brockman in the very center of the valley. Even though it was destined to last only 20 years, it was soon to become the school with the most students. A few years after its establishment, Allie Smith sold the district another couple of acres adjoining the school ground for a ball field. The school was booming in 1916. A couple of years after that, however, the population had shifted so drastically that the building and grounds were abandoned. Most of the residents of the Brockmans who had children were living against the hills on the west side. So the school took up a new residence in the Arthur Weaver family's homestead house, the Weavers having left the country. The last year it was in operation, it was housed at the vacant Adamson's home, which was central between the homes of the last two students, Mary Davidson and Lawrence Lane. The first teacher at the McDonald Peak School was Alice Stone. She was followed by Alpheus Ray. He boarded with Brockmans and married one of the area's eligible young ladies, Viola Rogers. In the later years, Daisy McDonald taught for a year at the McDonald Peak School. She had taught in schools all over the country previously, including Ash Valley and Madeline. Bertha Aker, the Plains locally trained teacher, also taught at the McDonald Peak School in 1918. All right, Termo School. Of the 4 school districts operating on the west side of the Madeline Plains during the Homestead era, the Termo School District was the last to be organized. It was established on the November 10, 1913. For the next couple of years, what scholars there were in the area met in a large room in the old NCO warehouse, which was also being used as a depot. Then in September 1915, all of the fathers in the area got together and donated time and materials for the construction of a building. Since the entire 200-acre tract of land that Termo sat on was owned by the railroad, the NCO donated 20 acres to the cause. Under the capable carpentry leadership of Tom Wood, a schoolhouse soon sprang up. One Saturday that summer, everyone was there to put finishing touches on the building. A final coat of shellac had been applied to the floor, and the shellacking rags had been set out on the porch to dry. Everyone went home that afternoon to clean up and get ready for the potluck dinner and dance that had been planned for that night to celebrate the completion of the new school. But late that afternoon, the rags that had been used to wipe up the shellac caught fire by spontaneous combustion as most of the party-goers watched helplessly from various distances away. They went right ahead and had their dance and celebration that night anyway, and undaunted began preparations for a new building. It was not long before the second Termo School was standing, but in the meantime it was back to the depot for the students. When the new schoolhouse was complete, it was a large frame building with a door at one end, windows down both sides, and a bare wood floor. In the center of the room was a wood stove for heating. Now, the second schoolhouse lasted longer than the first, as it is still standing in Termo, although it has been moved from its original location. Like all the schools in the area, students arrived at class by various means: on foot, on horseback, sometimes riding double or triple, and in buggies. Because of the deep snows and difficult traveling conditions, and possibly because Termo is the coldest spot on the Madeline Plains, if not in the nation, the Termo School was often operated as a spring and summer school in its early years. Now next is the Madelene School, or Madeline School. The school which had started first and lasted the longest was the Madeline School. It had been moved from Schoolhouse Point into the town of Madeline and had been operating there a couple of years when the Homestead era started. An addition and bell tower were built, making it somewhat larger when things really went to booming in Madeline around 1910. Some of the many teachers who taught at Madeline over the many years covered in this book were Eva Sparger, Mabel Sharp, Charlie Hunt, Natalie Harris, Lawrence Wilson, Mabel Dean, Bertha Aker, Cornelia Smith, Bart Steele, Nellie Evans, Eleanor Wright, Gracie Dumpry, Glenn Johnson, Daisy Cooper, and Daisy McDonald. Like all the other schools of the era during those years, Madeline had its problems with all sizes of students. Sometimes 8th grade boys were 15 or 16 years old and were hard to handle. The stories all seemed to have the same beginning and ending. A class would become pretty outlaw for a year or two under some poor, frail little lady who had just started teaching or just simply could not handle a bunch of rowdy boys. She would pack up and leave, and the district would quickly hire some tough schoolmaster, hardened by years of experience and possibly as much of an outlaw as the class was. In no time at all, he would have the students snapped into shape and be operating a model class. The situation occurred at least once in Madeline during the latter part of the Homestead era. Nida Northrup, probably on her first school teaching assignment, eventually found the terror at the Madeline School unbearable. Finally, she left and went back to her home in Big Valley, 3 months before school was let out. Then came a white-haired old man in his late 60s or early 70s. Mr. Reedy brought the situation under control in a few days. A wide leather strap was kept warm on the seats of the problem children's breeches until the idea sunk in. The followers were too scared and wide-eyed to even think about mischief. The ones who thought they could avoid well-deserved punishment by running found that some old men were pretty speedy. Whether they had any real remorse at that time is doubtful, but in the end they could see the wisdom and respect of Mr. Reedy. Some of those boys at least would like to meet Mrs. Northrup once again so they could apologize for their terrible behavior. Even by the time school was out that year, most of the class regretted their unruly behavior, as Glenn Olson was the only student who had behaved himself enough and studied enough to graduate into the next grade. All right, we'll stop there on page 323. Next time we'll pick up 323, chapter titled The Bailey Creek Sawmill.